Hello class. This week we're going to continue our discussion on classes, and we're going to start off this week talking about constructors. As you can see on your screen, I have a kind of a truncated version of this week's assignment. If you recognize some of this code, I will freely admit that I stole this from a couple of different students' assignments, but I took out the course or class, and this is just getting the student information. So this is approximately what your assignment should have looked like. You may have done things slightly differently, but there's a few things that I'd like to point out in this. The first thing that I want to point out is inside the class of student that we create, notice I don't have any console.writes or console.reads. All of that is done up here in the main method. The reason for that is to create to maximize the reusability of the code. We don't want to do anything in this class that directly interfaces with the user. What we want to do is we want to save that for the user interface. In this case, the console is the user interface, and the console is run in this static void main. This allows you to interact with the DOS window that you see pop up when we run this program. So it's good practice never to put any of these console.writes or console.reads inside a class that you are creating. You'll probably understand a little bit more why that's important when we start doing Windows programming and web programming. You'll see that doing that just doesn't work very well and it causes problems. So for now, trust me when I say you don't want to be doing that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was calling methods on the class. We had a couple of students that were a little confused about that and asked me to talk about that this week. So as you can see right here, here is where I create my student object. I have my student, which is the name of the student class that I'm giving it, and I'm creating a new student. Down here is where I actually call the method that I created on that my student object. Now the one thing to remember is you can never call a method from a class. You can, however, call a method from an object. So you have to create an object, and that's what we do right here with this line. We create a student object called myStudent. I can then access any of the public methods that are on myStudent by putting a dot and then typing the method name. So one thing in Visual Studio that you'll want to see is anytime you type the name of an object and put a period, the IntelliSense, is going to tell you what you have access to. You can see this set student info. It's got this little cube icon here that's telling me that that is a method that is on that object. These little blue cubes here are telling me that those are public members of that object. Another word for member is a variable. So here we've created the variables on the class student, and we have direct access to them by just putting a dot and doing whatever we want. So that is how you access a method on an object. You remember, you can never access a method directly from a class. You have to create an object in order to be able to access that method. The next topic that we're going to go over tonight is constructors. We touched on constructors a little bit in our last video, and I also noticed in the discussion forums that this week one of our students, I apologize, I don't remember who it was, had a eureka moment when they discovered that this new up here is you're actually calling a constructor. That is an important step to understanding how object-oriented programming works. So congratulations to I can't remember who it was, but that is truly one of those eureka moments, and it just feels great when you figure that out. So, but you're absolutely right. Right here, we are actually calling a constructor. Now, if you remember last week when I talked, if you don't put a specific constructor inside your class, it will do what it's called, it will do a default constructor. Basically, a default constructor is just an empty constructor method. So we'll go in here and we'll just create a constructor. The way you create a constructor is just by creating a method that has the exact same type or exact same name as the class, just like that. You'll notice that I don't have a return type here, and that's because we're not actually returning anything with this method. We're not even returning a void. We're using this to construct the object itself, so we don't want to, try to return a value or anything like that. Now, I didn't read any values in this constructor either, and that's because it's just a default constructor. And but that doesn't mean that I can't. And that is actually the what your assignment this week is to take this program, and instead of using the set student info methods to set info, I wanted you to create a constructor. And so that's really easy, and I'm going to show you how we do that here. I'm actually just going to cut and paste a few things. We're going to take this set student info method, and I need to set all of this information. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste that up into the constructor. Oops, missed the S. So now this constructor is expecting you to pass student name, student ID, student GPA, enrollment date, and graduation date. And we should, up above here in our main method where we're calling that constructor, we now have an error. And it's saying that error, there is no constructor on the class student that takes 0 objects. And that's what we're doing right here. Or sorry, 0 arguments. We're calling a constructor that has 0 arguments. Arguments are what you would have in between these parentheses there. So let's go back. We'll just finish fixing up our class before we go up and fix that. So we also need to set all of that stuff in our constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and copy, paste that up here. And so now when the constructor runs, it's going to read in all this information, and it's going to set our members with that information. So we'll go back up here. Let's just for now comment that out. So now we're going to need to create a my student object, but the reason why I'm commenting it out up here is because I really need to read all of this stuff in from the console before I can create that student object. So I'm going to go down here to after I've gone through and done my console.writes and console.reads, and I am going to add a line of code. I'm going to create a student object here. So I'm going to say student to tell it what class I want to use, name the object my student, and then I'm going to set that equal to a new student. Oops. And notice we still have our error, and that's because I need to throw some information in there. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste so I don't have to type all of this out again. Copy and paste is your friend when you're talking about programming. Boom, there we go. So now when I create that student object on the same line that I'm creating it, I'm also setting all of the information for that variable, or sorry, for that object while I create it. I no longer need this line here. And so let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So we run it, enter the student's name, just put in my name, student's ID, 123, student's GPA is 4.0 of course, since it's me. Enrollment date, we'll just throw any date in there, and then graduation date, throw another date in there, hit enter, and boom, there we go. So it spit back out all the information because the next line of the code says to do the toString, and the toString down here is right there. So something that's important to note is that you can actually have more than one constructor on an object. You'll notice, remember up here, as soon as I added my own defined constructor, the default constructor no longer existed. So it can't find that. But there are going to be times when potentially I don't want to use this constructor when I'm constructing this object. I want to use this one up here. And we can still do that. We can create a second constructor. Oops. That is just a blank constructor. And now this will take the place of that default constructor. And you'll notice it allows me to do that up here. Now, of course, I'm getting an error down here, and this is because I already have a variable named my student, so we're going to just say, call this my blank student. And it lets us do that. And we could call down here my blank student dot set student info, and do the exact same thing that we did before. And then we'll throw a console.write in here my blank student dot toString. And run that. And what we should get is, you can see, well, I didn't do it as right lines, I did it as right. So you'll see that it spit that out twice to us. So both ways of accessing this object are now perfectly viable. You can create a student object with a blank constructor and then set these values yourself, or you can use the constructor that sets the different variables while you're doing the constructor, and that will work as well. This is what's called overloading. And overloading simply means that you have more than one method that takes different arguments in that method. So here we have one method, it happens to be a constructor method, that takes 0 arguments, and then we have one method that takes string, string, double, string, string. You can create as many overloaded constructors as you'd like, as long as the number and type of arguments are different in that constructor. So I could create yet another constructor down here. Let's say that just reads in the student ID. You'll see these a lot when you're using databases or data files, where you may just want to get the ID of something, do a lookup in here of that database, and set all of this information from that database. Obviously, we haven't written a database for this application, so we're not going to do that. But you can see this is still valid code. I don't have any errors coming up. Now, it's important to note that with this overloading, that it's not these names that matter. It's not what you name the arguments. It's the number and type of arguments. So for me to create, if I were to create another student let's just do a string 1, string 2, double 3, string 4, string 5. This is not valid, and you can see we're getting some errors here. The reason why this is not valid is because I already have another constructor with the exact same pattern of arguments. I have string, string, double, string, string. Now this is actually giving us a fairly different error. I think if I just add another string here, let's call it a string instead of a sting, we should be okay. Nope, still doesn't like that. So it's just not liking my argument names there. That's why we're getting that error. But if I had actually named these something, oops, I missed some commas. That also might have been what was throwing us off. Yeah, okay, so there we go. So now you can see that that's acceptable. It really doesn't matter what I named those, but if I removed this one here, that would no longer be acceptable because we have two duplicate constructors with string, string, double, string, string. And you'll notice it's not giving me an error, but if I go to compile this, I would get an error because it doesn't know which constructor to use. Yep, you can see I'm already getting there was build errors. And let me pull up the error list here, and you can see that it's not liking that. The next topic that we're going to talk about are accessors and mutators. Now, if any of you have taken Java, you are probably familiar with the terms accessor and mutator. Basically, what it is, an accessor method is used to get information from a variable on a class, and a mutator method is used to set information on a variable on a class, or more specifically an object. A lot of programmers, and myself included, will tell you that it is good practice to not expose public variables directly on an object. There's several reasons for this. I'm not going to go into too much detail on why that is, but basically what we're saying is we shouldn't allow you to see from other methods these public or these members here. And the way we prevent that from happening is we set them as private. So let's just go ahead and set all of these as private. And what that's going to do, by setting these to private, these variables here, these members of the object student, or sorry, the class student, will only be accessible inside the constructors and other methods that run directly on this class. If I go up here now and I were to, let's just go ahead and delete out my blank student, we don't need that anymore. But if I were to try to access my student name, you'll notice that I no longer have access to that. It's not an option in the IntelliSense anymore. If we did want to give access to the student name, we could do that through what's called an accessor method. Up here, we could create a public string. We're going to call it, oh, hold on a second. Let me go ahead and just rename all of these variables. Whenever you're setting a private variable on a class, it is typical that you use a lowercase letter to start it and use this underscore here to note that that is a private member. So if we go up here and we create a public member of student name, we can then define methods underneath that member. And the two methods that we can define are get and set. So if I were to type get here, sorry. Sorry, a little bit of a moment there.